8:30.
Lee DeForest, Edwin Howard Armstrong, David Sarnoff, radio pioneers, men who transformed American lives but shattered their own. Empire of the Air, the men who made radio.
Wednesday at 8 here on Iowa Public Television.
You're watching Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching, IPTV.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer Newshour.
Good evening. I'm Roger Mudd in Washington.
And I'm Jim Lehrer in New York. After our summary of the news this Friday, we'll debate the newest skirmishes and the newest war with Japan. Then correspondent Paul Salmon explains why the business of recycling garbage is a bust. And David Gergen, Mark Shields, and a New Hampshire newspaper editor look at where matters stand in the New Hampshire primary campaigns.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer Newshour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
There was a new alert issued today about the quality of America's schools. Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander joined an advisory panel in calling for higher national standards for math, science, history, English, and geography. The panel said in a report to Congress that absent higher standards, education in this country has declined, with minimum achievement levels becoming acceptable. And it said U.S. students trail those in other countries in many school subjects. Colorado Governor Roy Romer, co-chairman of the panel, spoke at a Washington news conference.
We're saying to America, we need to raise our educational standards. We're going to do it collaboratively. We're going to do it together. We're going to do it promptly. And let me give you an illustration that I think can communicate to people. If you have been pole vaulting out in the middle of Iowa or Colorado for years and you thought that the mark you should reach for is 16 feet, and then one morning you wake up and you say, wait a minute, the world is jumping at 19 feet, what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is to raise our expectations and figure out how we get there. And that's precisely what's happening to us in education. Some people in the world are accomplishing a higher level of achievement. A parent in America, once we get standards in place, will be able to say, what should I expect out of my 8th grade youngster? What does my 8th grade youngster need to know in math in order to be a successful citizen of the world?
The panel said national standards for math had already been determined, but that standards in history, English, science, and geography are still being developed. The panel rejected having the federal government require local school districts to adopt tougher standards. Jim?
Prime Minister Miyazawa said today Japan would try to increase imports of U.S. goods. He said Japan owed its prosperity to the United States and would make every effort to help it overcome its economic problems. He said it in a speech to the opening session of Parliament, and it came amid heightened U.S.-Japanese trade and other tensions. U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hill said today the United States would retaliate if Japan fails to open its markets. She made the comments before a meeting of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington.
And I would urge Japan to open up its market because the feeling in this country is that their unfairness cannot go untreated, and that the remedies, although they will harm us here at home, will gravely harm Japan and the trading system.
A Japanese-led investor group may not be allowed to buy the Seattle Mariners. The president of Japan's Nintendo Group would own 60% of the Seattle baseball franchise under a proposal announced yesterday, but the deal requires the approval of Major League Baseball owners, and Baseball Commissioner Fay Vincent said he did not expect them to allow it.
Macy's biggest sale may be coming soon. CBS Chairman Lawrence Tisch has offered to buy the debt-ridden company, which owns 250 stores nationwide. The New York Times reported Tisch would invest nearly $1 billion to buy up stock and junk bonds from creditors and investors. Neither Tisch nor Macy's would confirm that a deal had been struck. Here in Washington, a federal judge approved a plea bargain agreement whereby the Bank of Credit and Commerce International will give up $550 million in assets. That would be the biggest forfeiture in U.S. history. The judge said the penalty would permanently incapacitate BCCI from ever doing business in this country and would allow depositors to get some of their money back. Bank officials have admitted to fraud and money laundering.
Secretary of State Baker discussed Israel's request for $10 billion in loan guarantees with the Israeli ambassador today. Baker met Ambassador Zalman Shoval at the State Department in Washington. The loan money at issue is to settle Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union and Ethiopia. The Bush administration has tied the issue to its opposition to continued construction of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Israel and China established formal diplomatic relations today. The foreign ministers of the two countries did it at a ceremony in Beijing. China is the last permanent UN Security Council member to establish ties with the Jewish state.
A new strain of tuberculosis is spreading in this country. The Centers for Disease Control reported that cases have been identified in Michigan, Florida, and New York, particularly in the New York State prison system. Most forms of the disease can be treated with drugs, but officials said the new strain is resistant to current medication. They said people infected with the AIDS virus were especially vulnerable. The Australian Olympic Committee said today its basketball team will play against the U.S. team even if Magic Johnson is on the court. Yesterday, the team doctor said Johnson posed a risk to the Australian players because he has the AIDS virus. But the Olympic Committee rejected the warning, and a top Australian AIDS researcher accused the doctor of preaching fear and hysteria.
South African President F.W. de Klerk promised blacks the right to vote for a new multiracial government today, but he said the white minority could veto the results. Jeremy Thompson of Independent Television News reports from Cape Town.
The marching bands drummed in what could be South Africa's last white-dominated parliament. The president's multiracial honor guard, a poignant reminder that while blacks can die for South Africa, they still can't vote for it. F.W. de Klerk came armed with promises that all that will soon change. But for all the pomp, this parliament has suddenly become a political sideshow. The president all but admitted that CORRESPONDENT, the Forum for Democratic Negotiation, was now the nation's driving force. Unlike the dramatic revelations of the last 2 years, he was left offering proposals instead of policies, suggesting that constitutional changes drawn up by CORRESPONDENT should be put to a referendum of all South Africans. The president insisted his white government wasn't dragging its feet.
There is a suspicion that the government's proposal concerning transitional government is designed to ensure continued domination by whites, or at least to the drawn-out withholding of full participation by black South Africans. I wish to put it clearly that there are no grounds for this suspicion.
Though Mr. de Klerk made a fresh commitment to a fully representative government of transition, he said the principle of self-determination was still open to negotiation, a clear sop to right-wingers who want a white homeland. Nearby, a demonstration of the pressure now being exerted on the government as the ANC held its own People's Parliament, hoping to upstage the official event. They were calling for the immediate dissolution of Parliament. They want a non-racial interim government within 6 months.
That parliament cannot be allowed to continue any longer. We're sick and tired of it.
The ANC is threatening mass action if its demands aren't met. People power is now forcing the pace of reform as the crowds marched round a parliament whose time is fast running out.
2 Army officers in El Salvador were sentenced to 30 years in prison today for murdering 6 Jesuit priests. The Jesuits were shot dead in November 1989, along with their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter.
Freddie Bartholomew, the popular child actor of the 1930s and 40s, has died. His wife said he died of emphysema yesterday in Sarasota, Florida. He was 67. Bartholomew began his career in Britain, but gained fame through the American films Little Lord Fauntleroy, Captains Courageous, and David Copperfield. For a time, he was the highest-paid child actor after Shirley Temple. He left films after his boyhood, eventually becoming an advertising executive.
And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to Japan bashing and vice versa, cashing in on trash, and Gergen and Shields in the New Hampshire primary. This has been a busy week in the war of words and money between the United States and Japan. A look at what's going on is what we do first tonight. Yesterday, some baseball fans cried foul over the attempt by a group of Japanese investors to buy the Seattle Mariners franchise. But the team, which has said it would be forced to move to Florida for financial reasons, welcomed the offer of $100 million from the group led by the president of Nintendo. But Fay Vincent, the baseball commissioner, said the sale was unlikely because of baseball's strong policy against foreign ownership. Wednesday, the city of Los Angeles scrapped plans to give a $122 million contract to Japan's Sumitomo Company to build new rail cars for its transit system and said it would start its own factory to produce American rail cars.
Both at the state level and at the local level, and I'll speak for our city, I'm now formulating legislation that would provide domestic content preference for our contracting process, for our bidding process. I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't do that. When we say we want to get the lowest responsible bid, part of the definition of responsibility should be local jobs, and I mean local here in Southern California and preferably in Los Angeles, and certainly American jobs.
Other towns and companies have been joining the Buy America bandwagon. For example, the Monsanto Company is giving its employees a cash incentive to buy an American car.
The Project Get Rolling is an attempt by Monsanto Chemical Company in offering each of our 12,000 North American employees a $1,000 incentive to purchase or lease a North American assembled new car, van, or truck to help the auto industry, which in turn will help Monsanto Chemicals since it's a very important downstream business for us.
And in Detroit, tempers were boiling over a remark by a Japanese legislator on Tuesday who said American workers were generally lazy and illiterate.
The average guy that works around here really puts his heart and soul in his job. Does a good job at it, too. And to hear that kind of stuff, that's good.
While the Japan criticizing has gotten more vocal this past week, there have been attempts to soften some of the volume.
How many of the protectionists that we have ever mentioned that Japan is the single largest market for American agricultural exports and our second largest market overall? Obviously, the trends are moving clearly and strongly in the right direction. And to suggest otherwise is simply mindless Japan bashing.
And today, Kiichi Miyazawa, the Japanese prime minister, tried to soothe over some of the tensions in a speech to his parliament. He said, Japan could not have achieved its post-war prosperity without America's good-hearted support. But late today, U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills told Japan it might face tough new trade laws unless it changed its policies.
The feeling in this country is that their unfairness cannot go untreated, and that the remedies, although they will harm us here at home, will gravely harm Japan and the trading system.
Now, 4 perspectives on this escalating series of events and statements. Samuel Popkin, a political scientist at the University of California, San Diego, has been involved in polling and analyzing American and Japanese attitudes about the other since 1985. Senator Donald RIEGLE, Democrat of Michigan, is chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. He accused a high-level Japanese official of slandering Americans this week. KIICHI MOCHIZUKI is chairman of the Pacific Institute, a policy study organization funded by the Japanese Trade Ministry. He's a former president of Nissin USA, a Japanese-owned steel company in the United States. He has lived here since 1968 and is a naturalized citizen. Carol GLUCK is a professor of Japanese history at Columbia University. Professor GLUCK, what's caused this latest outbursts, these latest exchanges and all this sort of thing these last several days?
It's been a pretty flammable week, I agree. I think that it's always a cardinal principle of Japanese and American relations that the images that Americans have of Japan change in relationship to what's going on in the United States. So our attitudes are basically made in America. And that means, as we all know, the situation in the American economy, or as we heard tonight, in the American educational system. And it's what we are worried about ourselves that has driven up the emotional temperature in this past week. And on the other side, it's always true, I think, that Japanese attitudes toward the United States are also made in America. And I think you heard it tonight with the Prime Minister of Japan, who is in a sense reflecting or trying to reflect what he thought Americans were thinking Japan ought to do.
In other words, he didn't. You mean he wasn't really apologizing for what the Speaker of the Parliament said earlier in the week. He thought this is what the Americans want to hear on Friday.
No, he wants to do what he thinks the Americans want Japan to do, and it's this disjunction, you see, where we change our images about Japan depending on our own situation here, and Japan changes images about us depending on what we think of them.
I see.
And so he's trying. But that probably isn't the right tack either.
Senator RIEGLE, do you agree with Professor Gluck that if we didn't have a trade deficit with Japan, if our economy was doing great, if our education system was working, we wouldn't be talking about this tonight because nothing would be going on in terms of bad words between Japan and the United States?
I think if we had had a fair trading relationship with Japan over the last decade or two and we were in good, strong economic condition as they are, I think we'd be on a much different footing, and that's the part of the problem. That's why it needs to be changed. But that's not where we find ourselves. America today is in serious economic trouble. We've got over 16 million people in this country that want to work, want full-time work, and can't find it. And last year, Japan had a trade surplus with us in their favor of $42 billion. And it's been that way year after year after year. If you go back to 1980, since 1980, Japan has taken $460 billion out of the United States, and that's created great strength in Japan, but it's created a significant part of the weakness here in America. But it's not our only problem. We've got other problems here in America that we have to solve here in this country, but the systematic trade cheating by Japan that's created these huge deficits is also now an important part of the problem.
But then take me the next couple of steps that caused the Speaker of the Parliament to say what he said, and then caused you to accuse him of slander and all of that. What, is this just a natural flow out of a trade deficit problem?
No, I think there is more than that, Jim. I think there is a kind of contempt in those comments that we have heard from leaders in Japan, not just the Speaker of the lower house, but also from Mr. Toyota. I think there is a feeling that somehow America, by some key Japanese leaders, that America is somehow second-rate, that we can't compete. I think that's a very dangerous miscalculation on their part. In my mind, that's the same type of miscalculation that led to the mistakes that opened up World War II. I think by 1945, Japan understood what America was all about, and I would hate to see us get on a course in the future where the economic damage done here by Japan and by unfair trade practices leads us back to a very unfriendly relationship. That would be bad for both countries.
Mr. Mochizuki, what do you think is behind these comments coming from Japan this way? The accusation from one of the leaders of the government in public that American workers are lazy, American workers are illiterate. Is that a reflection of how the average Japanese views the Americans?
Well, I don't know everything, but I also heard from somewhere that somewhere in the Midwest, the American factory itself tried to hire somebody for some 100 jobs, and 3,000 applicants showed up, and they were able to hire only 50 because not everybody was up to the standard and so on. And from that point of view, it's always happening everywhere. And of course, factory managers tend to complain that the quality is not good enough, and so on and so on. And those things go on. And I think what's interesting here is that the communication these days is so intense through these journalism and equipment and so on. That he was talking in back of his countryside with his constituents. I was wondering why it was detected. It's very interesting. And
why it was reported? Why was it the press was there?
It's a very sensitive issue, and the people react to it in a negative way. It's a journalistically variable. But the point is that now that we are living in, even we sneeze in the bathroom, each other knows, so that our mind has to become larger together with it. So you don't become sort of jumping around just because of a cup of coffee in the bathroom.
Well,
that's the basic thing.
All right, speaking of sneezing in the bathroom, what would your, I know you haven't done anything scientific, but what would be your guess as to what the Japanese attitude would be about this reaction to Japanese investors wanting to actually put money in the United States and buy a baseball team in Seattle? And now apparently you're going to be told, no, they can't do that.
Well, certainly emotions are flaring up, and Senator Rieger is quite right that we have to really watch it and to keep it under control. This is ridiculous to have both emotions flaring up over certain unnecessarily unimportant matters. So on this thing, for example, it is not reasonable, from Japanese perspective at least, to have that kind of the reactions to the purchase of the automobile. I hear that the locality is welcome and so on and so on. But also Japanese should understand, and I'm sure they understand, that this type of thing in this particular emotional situation, maybe they should reserve. You know, you don't lose any money for not buying a baseball team, and if it's getting such a negative reaction, there's no point of pushing forward. Back off. It's nothing serious about this. So what's the matter? Put this thing in the whole perspective. Yeah. We are helping each other. We are saying, the Japanese are saying that the Japanese are appreciative of Americans. And sometimes they're crazy people. I shouldn't say crazy people, but some people who use the tongue in the strong manner on the side of the United States, on the side of Japanese. But we are humans, so why don't we tolerate certain things and put it in perspective? The trade, I don't know whether I should go on, but
Jim, could I make a comment on the baseball situation, because it is in the news, and I think if a German company wanted to buy an American baseball team today, I think they would find the same resistance, because that's been the pattern of keeping local ownership in baseball here in the United States. But it does illustrate a bigger problem, and that is Japan now has so many dollars that it's accumulated, this $460 billion since 1980, that they are in a position to buy strategic assets in this country. Not that baseball as such is in the same category as buying a major company or a major product in a biotechnology area or an aviation area. But what Japan has done systematically over the last several decades, they have targeted key industries in America: consumer electronics, computer chips, the automobile industry, increasingly aviation, and in effect have either destroyed those industries or have very substantially impaired them. At the same time, they've kept their home market closed, as you know, not just to American goods, but to goods from other countries. So that's
just a minute, wait a minute. All right, we're not going to do the whole, this isn't all about trade here. I'm talking about attitude. I want to get Professor Popkin in here from San Diego. That's what you do, Professor Popkin, is look at the attitudes of not only the Japanese people toward the United States, but the other way. Could you have predicted that this was going to happen? Is this an inevitability that these emotions, these differences were going to come out the way they have?
Yes. The minute the Soviet Union started falling apart, I knew that we were going to have increased presidential level discussions with Japan, because the collapse of the Soviet Union meant the American people thought of the president more and more in economic terms and more in Asian terms. And every year since 1985, Americans have been more concerned with Japan as both a rival and a partner, and with Japan and the ways in which Japan is better or not as good as we are. And I must say, though, listening to Senator Riegel, one of the reasons that John Conley failed in 1980, Walter Mondale failed in 1984, and Dick Gephardt failed again in 1988, is you're not facing the fact that it's easy for you to put all this together as a senator from Michigan, where all the jobs are. Most of the American people think that there was something preposterous about asking Japan to buy cars we wouldn't buy. There's not going to be protectionism to protect Detroit in this country. Well, but what you're going to see is more and more of a demand that Japan be opened to our winning products. I've never seen a miscalculation as big as George Bush leading with Lee Iacocca instead of leading with agriculture, high-tech, and biomedical.
Can I just respond?
No, you can in a minute, Senator. Hold on just a minute. But let me ask you this, Professor Popkin. You heard what Senator RIEGLE said a moment ago, that if it was the Germans who were proposing to buy the Seattle Mariners, it wouldn't be that, it would be the same problem because the rules of organized baseball are the same. But the public reaction to the fact that the Japanese were interested in buying the Seattle Mariners, do you think it would be the same? In other words, is there growing antipathy toward the Japanese because they're Japanese, not because of necessarily all the things that they may or may not be doing?
I think the word is not antipathy, the word is awe. The word is concern. You know, if Germany bought Rockefeller Center or the Alamo or whatever, it wouldn't even make the front page. It's news when Japan does it because Japan is becoming the super race of winners. People are more concerned about South Korea and Taiwan and the People's Republic than they are about Germany as an economic threat. They're scared of Japan buying things.
If I may say, that oversimplifies it. You know, you've got an example right there in California. It has nothing to do with the automobile industry, where the decision was just made to reverse on this issue of buying these subway or train cars. And they did it for reasons of the fact that they want to provide jobs for people in California. This is
Senator RIEGLE, you just changed the subject.
50-state problem. No, I'm not changing the subject at all, because you're seeing in California a reaction there, which is centered on the fact that you've got very high unemployment in that state as well as the other 49.
As the keeper of the subject, I want to go to Professor Gluck here. Where is this all headed, Professor Gluck? I mean, is it going to stay like this as long as the United States remains in a recession? Is it that simple? Once our problems get better, then Japan won't seem that much of a threat, or is it that simple?
Well, you're an optimist if you think that Japan will stay still while we come through our recession and change our attitudes again. I think, look, there's three things that are going on here, and they're related, but we really need to separate them when we think about them. One is what's going on in the United States, and that is our economic situation, social, educational, etc. The second is our trade or economic relationship with Japan, where there are real problems that the Senator points to and that Ambassador Hills points to. There are inequities that have to be resolved. They are localized and need to be resolved, and both countries have to work at it. That's the second. The third, however, is this larger Japanese-American relationship. I mean, this is not a relationship that's built of rice and automobiles alone. It's a long historical product. It's not unlike the special relationship between Britain and the United States, and there were decades in which Britain was just as angry and resentful toward the United States as the United States passed Britain by in terms of world power as the Americans are towards Japan. Now, these three are separate. The third one is very important not only to the two countries, but to the world as a whole, since these are the two major economies in the world. If we don't cooperate, then everybody's going to suffer. Now, it seems to me that those three things, if they're not separated, the whole house of cards, if you like, can collapse. We're not going to solve our American problems.
What house of cards?
All three of them. We won't solve our American domestic problems by blaming Japan, and the Senator has said that. We've got problems here. We're never going to solve our trade problems, which are real with Japan, our inequities, if we let the emotions go crazy. And third, and this is the answer to your question about the future, if we are so trans-Pacific bashing all the time, we are also likely to lose the relationship altogether. Because I think one result of the direction that it's going in now is that the increasing isolation between the two countries, Japan facing elsewhere, perhaps Asia, America facing elsewhere, turning their backs to the Pacific, and both countries will lose from it. So we don't have a whole lot of time to flail about in, I think, emotional reactions.
But Mr. Yes, sir. Mr. Mochizuki, let me ask you this, though. You said earlier that it may not be necessarily a bad thing that we're all talking about this. The people, it's emotional, but why not among friends? Friends have disagreements, and they're having it all out there. Senator RIEGLE feels free to say anything he wants to. The Speaker of the Japanese Parliament is free to say anything he wants to. Why
However,
not?
sometimes the problem is Americans feel that they feel free to say anything, but they don't feel free to hear anything from Japanese. But the point is make it.
In other words, we can take it.
Well,
I mean, we can
don't take it too heavy. My comment. What I would like to say mainly here is the perspective. Japanese, I know they're becoming a little bit antagonistic up there, but they should take it in perspective. Germans versus Japanese issue about Rockefeller Center or baseball team and so on. Let's say this is not racism. This is the most basic principle of this country, so I don't believe it's racism. Let's believe it's not a racism. But it's fact that the Americans are generally...
You don't think it is racism?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Let's say Americans are not accustomed to Asians, Japanese, and so on, compared with other people, let's say in general, in majority. Therefore, it takes time to get accustomed to Japanese actions. And somebody said this is a matter of vintage. Short time, too rapid, and so on. Takes time for any mind to digest. Japanese should understand and shouldn't get mad. And on the other hand, in the automobile investments and so forth that everybody's talking about, and the trade and so forth, let's Americans take this in perspective. The transplant with the lower local contents than you want is better than pure import, isn't it? It's a progress. It's better. And then 5 years later, if the local content is 70%, hopefully, then 30%. It's better and so on. It's
a Japanese car.
It's a progress
To
here.
put it simply, a Japanese car made in the United States is better than a Japanese car made in Japan. From an American point of view.
In terms of job consideration.
That's what I mean. From an American.
Isn't that? It is obvious.
He's right, is he not, Senator?
Jim, the problem is, according to Japan's numbers, in the month of December, 1 month ago, Japan took $4.5 billion out of the United States, much of it through unfair trade. For them to come and build plants here, keep most of the high value-added work at home, use us to do sort of the worker bee work, and then rebate the profits to Japan, that's a wonderful strategy for Japan today and in the future. America needs a strategy to grow this economy. We don't have one right now, and that's a problem within this country. The Bush administration doesn't understand it, hasn't moved in that area. But we have got to have an internal strategy where business and government and labor in America concentrate on our economic future and create enough high value-added jobs in this country. Japan, through the trade cheating, is holding us back from doing that. We've got to deal with both problems.
Let me ask Professor.
I think there's an over-evaluation of the Japanese smartness. Japanese are not that smart. So this is a sort of unintended outcome. I don't know how Senator calculated the 4 billion number and so on. But if there is a problem of a repatriation of the profit, let's work on it one by one.
Yeah. Let me ask Professor Popkin in San Diego, do your surveys show any relationship between the attitudes of Americans toward the Japanese that are racially oriented at all?
What's astonishing to me is how little racism is a part of all this. It's true, as Professor Gluck says, it's about attitudes about America, but it's attitudes about our strength. As Americans get more concerned about their own the country's economic future, they become more willing to work in the U.S. in Japanese factories. I find in all the surveys I've done for years, the difference in concern about Japan and Germany or Canada has got to do much more with the sense of the powerful country that will take away our destiny than it does of any racial difference. Americans really respect the Japanese work ethic. There's a lot of fairness. There's not racism here. And the foreign policy types who are worried about the David Dukes dominating this debate are making a very big mistake. The healthiest debate we've had in this country in years is the debate that George Bush so clumsily started on his recent trip to Japan.
You mean that the most Americans feel more challenged by the Japanese than they do threatened?
They're challenged and they're concerned and they're worried. They don't feel that there's something unfair being done when they don't buy Chryslers. What's really finally starting to happen is a concern that the U.S. doesn't have a strategy, I believe, for protecting the winners. When you ask Americans whether we should save the country by keeping out Japanese products or force Japan to open up, they overwhelmingly say they want to open up Japan. This is not Smoot-Hawley days.
Good
The
luck in
American
opening
people
up
think
Japan.
about this very carefully.
Very good luck in opening up Japan. Look, you don't have to love Lee Iacocca to think that the auto industry is important to America. It's about 4.5% of our gross national product, and there are about 2.5 million people that work there. If that industry largely disappears, we don't really have replacement industries of that size coming online, and that's really the problem. The problem is our own economic future. There was a story the other night from Chicago where they're opening a hotel. There were several thousand people lined up in sub-zero temperatures to file their resumes in hopes of getting a job. Those are all people needing work, not able to find it. We don't have in America today coming online the number of good, high value-added jobs for our people. And every job that's taken out of America, whether it goes to Japan or whether it goes to Mexico
Senator,
or some other place, hurts this country.
All right.
At the beginning
Senator,
of this segment,
yes, we have to leave it there. Senator, Ms. Gluck, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Next tonight, a visit to Arlington, Texas, where the world's new economic and political order is carrying a 1-2 punch. The end of the Cold War means fewer jobs in the defense industry, and the success of Japanese auto imports may soon mean no jobs in automaking. Just a week before Christmas, General Motors announced a massive cost-cutting program to reduce its workforce and shut down several assembly plants. GM's Arlington facility is on the hit list. City fathers met with auto officials today to show them a package of incentives designed to keep the plant running. We have a report from Betty Ann Bowser of public station KIICHI, Houston.
Richard Green owns the largest General Motors dealership in Arlington, Texas. This is his showroom on a recent Monday afternoon. It was empty. And here it is a week later on a Wednesday afternoon.
Car business, it's lousy. We are seeing some of the worst days that most people in the business can remember.
And this is Richard Green working at his other job as unpaid mayor of Arlington, a city of 270,000. He knows as well as anyone that closing the GM assembly plant, the city's largest employer and taxpayer, would have a devastating effect on the folks who live here.
The loss of 3,800 jobs that probably can be conservatively multiplied times 3 to determine the real job loss that is connected directly to the plant's operations. That, together with a payroll of $150, $175 million that compounds to over $1 billion statewide, I mean, we're talking about major economic impact on our community and on our state.
The entire economic corridor from Dallas west to Fort Worth in central Texas is already hard hit with job displacement. These scenes were shot when thousands of workers were laid off last year from General Dynamics. The Defense Department is in the process of closing Carswell Air Force Base, and 2 other defense contractors in the Arlington area are expecting future layoffs. Bud Weinstein is an economist who's studying what all this means to Central Texas.
If on top of those layoffs and closures, we see the closing of the GM plant, we're talking about another 4,000 jobs that would disappear immediately, another 3,000 to 4,000 jobs that would disappear as a result of the ripple effects, and probably a $400 to $500 million loss of annual purchasing power.
When General Motors came to Arlington in 1951, this was just a sleepy little farm town about halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth. City fathers say after GM came here, other companies had the confidence to invest in Arlington too. The first Six Flags amusement park was built here, along with a huge water park that bring millions of visitors and their money each summer. Arlington also has the Texas Rangers, Nolan Ryan, and acres of nearby vacant land that will soon become a new state-of-the-art baseball park.
I think anybody who wants to get a size of General Motors in the very near future got that picture today based
When
on where
CEO Robert Stempel announced GM would close either the Arlington plant or another plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, he did not ask either community to offer the company anything. And he said firmly that GM would not encourage a contest between the Texas and Michigan cities or the local unions to keep their plant.
We are not in the process of whipsawing. I want to be very clear about that right up front. That's not behind this at all. We really do have a lot of things to look at in both communities.
Still, with so much at stake, Arlington City Fathers did not wait for an invitation to join the sweepstakes.
We're talking about trying to preserve a benefactor to the community that helps.
The winner will not only get to keep its plant, GM says it will expand whichever facility it keeps, creating more jobs. Tell me what the city of Arlington, Texas is willing to do to keep the GM plant here.
Well, we're willing to do just about everything that is within our power and ability to do.
So, Arlington is putting a comprehensive economic package on the table, including 2 major tax incentives. If GM stays in Arlington, the city will give the company a tax break on future expansion. It won't cost the taxpayers anything and could save GM up to $18 million. Working with the state, the city would also create an enterprise zone that could save GM additional millions in state taxes.
Our proposal will show General Motors that Texans have the guts to put their money where their mouth is.
Even Texas Governor Ann Richards is trying to save the plant by promising the state will buy GM, and she urged local governments and businesses to do the same. The area has mounted a public relations campaign heralding GM as the heartbeat of Arlington. Over at Woodcock Hall, United Auto Workers Union Local 276 is supporting the public relations campaign. Outside in the parking lot, bumper stickers abound. Inside, the membership is worried and thinking about what they can do. Dave Perdue is 276 president.
When you're an unskilled worker working in an unskilled job and the unemployment rate is as high as it is today, there's so much competition out there, I think anybody in his right mind would do just about anything to keep his job.
Although national UAW leaders don't like to hear it, local 276 members are talking about working longer hours for the same amount of money, and a number of other strategies they hope will keep GM in Arlington.
GM denies that it's whipsawing. The Arlington local does not describe it as whipsawing.
George Green is a University of Texas labor historian.
But the drawn-out public decision-making process does literally invite communities and locals to make financial offers, to come up with tax abatement plans. And this certainly has the appearance of whipsawing.
Again, Arlington Mayor Green.
I don't feel whipsawed. I feel like that what we're doing is the same thing that we do in our economic development program in dealing with any corporation that we're trying to attract to our community or that we're trying to encourage that they expand in our community or that we're trying to retain. This is a retention effort.
With an economy that is so dependent on manufacturing and the defense industry, retention is the name of the game. And economist Weinstein says cities like Arlington are having to adjust not only to the changing economic realities of the area, but also the world.
I think what we're discovering in the short term is that peace is hell. That we had what has sometimes been called a permanent wartime economy that had a lot to do with the economic prosperity in this nation. And as we adjust to a different global environment, to less international tensions, and the concomitant reduction of defense spending, we're seeing a lot of local dislocations, and it's going to take us 3 to 5 years to adjust to the new economic and political realities.
Brenda and MC Sims both work at GM and were married each for the second time 6 months ago.
When do the report cards come out?
If the plant goes, so do both of their jobs.
If you work for General Motors, you know that you've got the possibility of being laid off any time. I remember when I first hired in, I said, you mean I've really got a permanent job? And he said, son, no job out here is permanent. I mean, you know, you think about everything that was prepared for when we thought that we were going to go to war with Russia and all this kind of stuff. And now then Russia's, you know, collapsing to the point of collapse, and people are not worried about it. You know, all the all the things that we built, the war machines that we built, and you know, they say, well, let's stockpile them or let's melt them down and put them into peacetime stuff, and it kind of slows everything down.
If GM does close here, the Sims say they're young enough to change careers. Like so many people who live in industrial, defense-driven economies, they are having to change to meet a changing world.
It's Friday, and that means it's time for analysis of the political week that was. We get the analysis from our regular team of Gergen and Shields, plus one. The Gergen is David Gergen, editor-at-large at U.S. News & World Report, and the Shields is syndicated columnist Mark Shields. The plus one is Mike Pride, who's with us tonight because he's editor of the Concord, New Hampshire Monitor, and New Hampshire is where half of America's politicians and press seem to be living. And he joins us from the studios at public station WENH in Durham, New Hampshire. Mike, the polls indicate that Governor Clinton is slightly ahead. President Bush seems to be well ahead. Do you think the Bush lead is going to hold up between now and the primary 3 weeks hence?
Well, I think that's very difficult to say. The problem for Bush is pretty obvious. I mean, we're in terrible shape here, and people are angry and they're blaming him. The question remains whether they will take the scorn that you hear expressed toward him in some quarters and cast a vote for Pat Buchanan. I think my own view is that in the end, New Hampshire voters like to vote for someone they think can be president, and Pat Buchanan doesn't seem to be such a person.
What kind of campaign is Buchanan running? Smart one?
I think he's running a very smart one, a very good on-the-ground New Hampshire-type campaign. He's making a lot of appearances, pressing the flesh. He's out there. He's quite a good candidate, I believe.
I heard that he began running this week, or perhaps yesterday, ads on the radio that have become effective. Tell me about those.
It's a terrific ad. It's an ad that begins with the Read My Lips, No New Taxes pledge from George Bush. And basically you have the President of the United States making a promise that he didn't keep. And to me, it's going to be quite effective and have quite an effect, positive effect for the Buchanan campaign.
Do you think there's a possibility that Buchanan could beat the spread, so to speak? Pull more than 30%?
Well, oh yeah, I think there's a chance he could pull more than 30%. I think there's a good chance of that. Most people remember up here that the race in 1988 was a Dole Bush race, but in fact there were three more conservative candidates, Pat Robertson, Pete DuPont, and Jack Kemp, who pulled more than 30% of the vote among them. And I think that that's probably Buchanan's base, not that all those people are going to vote for Pat Buchanan, but that he starts with that, and then I think you add the anger about Bush, and I think he could certainly do better than 30%.
Let's talk about Democrats. Is Clinton's lead solid? Will that hold up, you think, for 3 weeks?
I look at the polls, and I don't trust the polls at all. You know, I've been up here for 4 primaries, and in every case, in the last 72 hours of the campaign, something has happened that's caused a real groundswell for some candidate or another on one side or another. You had the Ronald Reagan in 1980 with that I paid for that microphone, and within 3 days he had 50% of the vote. In 1984, you had Gary Hart kind of coming out of nowhere in the last 2 or 3 days, and it was like there was something in the water, and he beat Walter Mondale. And last time you had on the Democratic side there wasn't much, but on the Republican side you had Dole looking like he had all the momentum coming in, and then with some ads that Bush ran toward the end and some things he did toward the end, there was a big shift there. So I really hesitate to say that Clinton's support is very solid. You also see in these polls that if you go behind the poll and read the stories 2 or 3 days later, a lot of people who said they were for Bill Clinton last time have switched votes. So there's a lot of vote switching going on.
Let me ask you, Mike, what effect you think the rash of stories that broke out yesterday about Governor Clinton's alleged relationship with a Little Rock television reporter, a woman, a story that appeared apparently paid for by the supermarket tabloid Star, what effect those allegations will have on Clinton's chances?
Well, I think the big question is how that story is going to play out over the next few days.
How'd the Monitor play that this evening?
above the fold on page 1.
Oh, should it have been there?
I don't know. It was a very hard day to be the editor of the capital city newspaper in Concord, New Hampshire. We made the decision this morning, weren't happy with it when we made it, and weren't happy with it in retrospect.
Let me ask now David Gergen and Mark Shields whether, given what Mike has just said, playing the story front page above the fold, that America's media is now being led around by the nose by the supermarket tabloid Star.
I think there's that case can certainly be made, Roger.
Do you make it?
That we are, well, I guess there's two things that have to be addressed. First of all, George Bush had a great week. George Bush had a great week because I think Mike's own poll as well shows that Bill Clinton is leading George Bush 43-36 in New Hampshire right now, and which is absolutely remarkable considering this is a state where Ronald Reagan got 69% of the vote in '84 and George Bush got 63% in 1988. So for the first time, you've got a named Democrat actually running ahead of the President of the United States in a poll by a very respected newspaper. And so this story of Clinton, about Clinton, is knocked that news right off the front page and put it back. It is a page story in a supermarket tabloid by a paper that reports regularly that Hitler is alive and living in the Falkland Islands with an ex-UCLA cheerleader. But I think since 1987, we have been put on notice. We, the presidential candidates, have been, that the character issue includes reckless personal behavior and judgment. And part of that is how one comports himself in personal matters. The test now will be Bill Clinton, how he handles himself against these charges and all the rest of them. They've been simmering for years. I mean, and reporters have heard them for years. They've been investigated. No one's come up with them for years.
Do you think Clinton deserves this treatment?
No.
Or should have expected it?
He expected it, but he doesn't deserve it. I would, to use Mark's phrase, I think the press has been reckless in much of the coverage of this entire campaign.
Reckless disregard?
Reckless disregard. First of all, Roger, we in effect almost inaugurated the fellow before the first vote was cast in New Hampshire. To put him on the cover of major national news magazines, to say in effect he's got it wrapped up, to begin talking about where the Clinton Presidential Library ought to be. I think we got way ahead of the curve on that and manipulated the campaign. And I think if you were in the Bob Kerrey campaign or the Harkin campaign, you would have had legitimate objections to that. Now, having set him up, it seems to me we in the press are trying to knock him down. I think Mark is right. I think the real test comes in how he's going to handle himself. And very interestingly, he has chosen what I think can only be defined as or said to be a high-risk strategy, but one that may have high payoff. And that is he's chosen the biggest audience in America to take his case to. He's agreed now to go on 60 Minutes on Sunday night. CBS is carrying the Super Bowl that evening, and just after the Super Bowl, up comes 60 Minutes with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton to present their case. Rather than going for the sound bite, they've gone for the biggest audience for 15 minutes. This will be the biggest moment in his political career between now and a potential Democratic nomination.
His first decision was to go on CNN on Saturday on a Newsmaker program, and then he switched and went to 60 Minutes. What does that mean? Why is he going on 60 Minutes?
Well, I assume he's going on 60 Minutes because he wants to do the checkers number. I mean, to go the biggest thing of all, to try and put this behind him once and for all, to address it in a complete fashion. I guess. I mean, that's the only possible strategy.
He has to have absolute confidence in his case, and I think it does two things for him, Roger. If the Clinton campaign, he told Mike Kramer of Time Magazine about a week ago, I'm looking forward to the moment when I have to have this big test. This is his big test. I think if he passes it well, it will obviously help his campaign. If he fails, the campaign is going to crumble. Beyond that, this is a chance to introduce him and his wife to the American people in their living rooms in a setting which will people get to know them a little bit. A lot of Americans still don't know who this fellow is.
If I had my brothers and I were managing a campaign, which I did in a previous life, I'd just as soon not have them introduce the American people answering about alleged extramarital activity.
But if he handles it well, Mark, it'll be a plus.
Let's talk about, in the time we've got, the Republican campaign and President Bush. How President Bush said that he would do anything he had to do to win. You think he's doing everything he has to do?
Pat Buchanan said that's the one promise he knows he'll keep. But I think that the Concord Monitor poll today that Mike Pride referred to earlier is absolutely revealing to George Bush. He's at 58% by their measurement. This is an incumbent president of the United States who was nominated in this state, who got 63% in the general election, he's 8 points above a majority. He's running
against Pat Buchanan.
Against Pat Buchanan.
That's not much, is it?
That is not a reassuring position to be in 3 weeks out. And Mike is absolutely right about the historic precedents up there, big changes. It's highly unlikely there'd be a major change in George Bush's support. I mean, but he could lose 10 points. He could lose 12 points. If that were the case, I don't know if Pat Buchanan has that kind of growth potential. I mean, people could just sit it out.
What's your opinion of his campaign, David?
Well, he clearly has been foundering here recently, but we're all leading up, of course, to the State of the Union next week. And the White House has now set this up as the most important address of his presidency. And I think they're in a very high-risk situation, too, as they go into the State of the Union, because, Roger, there's been so much buildup. It reminds me very much of when Jimmy Carter went up to Camp David and was closeted up there for 2 weeks. We all waited for him to come down off the mountain to tell us what he was going to do, and then he gave that Malay speech, which just killed him. But the early returns are already starting to come in on the Bush speech, even before he gives it. Business Week had a cover out today saying, this is pallid, too cautious, too conservative. If I can make one other point, Roger. The other danger for the president, I'm not even sure he's aware this is happening. His staff, with the replacement of John Sununu, is increasingly demoralized and chaotic within the White House. There's an awful lot of unhappiness in that institution right now.
Not been fixed yet, huh?
Not been fixed and gotten worse in a lot of ways. People thinking about bailing out. This is not the way you want to start a campaign. The president needs to pay attention to his own family here as well as his speech.
Go ahead, Mike.
If I might add one thing, I think that you might be a bit mistaken to think that Bush is his campaign is foundering. I think that on the ground in New Hampshire, I think it played very well. It played a lot better than it played in the national media. One of our reporters who covered it wrote a column in the paper today where he talked about how the people that Bush actually spoke with were quite impressed, heard his message and took it as very heartfelt and real. Now, the press, national press, played it up as, to some extent, so much cornpone, but it played pretty well up here.
I'm glad you spoke up, Mike. I'm sorry I ignored you for a few minutes. In just a second or two we have left, what does Bush have to do on Tuesday night to... he could win or lose the presidency Tuesday, couldn't he?
What George Bush has to do, yes, I think it is the most important speech of his presidency thus far. What George Bush has to do is he has to persuade real people that he's proposing real changes that are going to touch their lives. I mean, it can't be, something that's going to please, deregulation of or whatever else. It's got to be something that's really, people are going to say, hey, that is going to make a difference. This guy understands what's wrong. That's leadership. What was working against George Bush is the very success he had in the Persian Gulf. And of crafting that remarkable, forging that incredible coalition. And now there's a sense that if he could do that, what's he indifferent to what's going on at home? It's really hurting him.
Thank you, David, Mark, and Mike. Jim?
Again, the major stories of this Friday. A federal advisory panel on education called for higher national standards. They said U.S. education goals had declined, with minimum achievement levels becoming acceptable. Japan's prime minister said his country owed its prosperity to the United States and would make every effort to help the United States out of its economic troubles. And tonight, CBS Chairman Lawrence Tisch withdrew his offer to buy Macy's after one of the store's major creditors objected to the deal. Good night, Roger.
Good night, Jim. We had planned to bring you a Paul Solomon report on the business of recycling garbage, but time constraints got in the way tonight, so we'll schedule it again in the near future. That's all for this evening. We'll see you Monday night with a Newsmaker interview with CIA Director Robert Gates. Have a nice weekend. I'm Roger Mudd. Thank you and good night.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer Newshour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. and by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television, where each Friday you can review the week in Washington, on Wall Street, and in agribusiness. Look at life in Iowa and enjoy music from Austin's city limits.
Market to Market returns to rural Georgia to see how non-teaching professionals fared in their first year of teaching in an innovative program designed to find staff for inner city and rural schools.
I must admit that my biggest accomplishment was going through the whole year without quitting from teaching.
A follow